The battlefield was a wasteland, littered with debris and scorched earth under a dim, alien sky. The Galactic Empire had claimed another victory, but at what cost? Among the wounded and the fallen lay Nyx, the alpha wolf of the Vranax. Her once pristine black fur was matted with blood, and her heaving breaths came in ragged gasps. Her cubs, small and trembling, pressed close to her side, their wide, glowing eyes filled with fear. The Vranax commander barked orders to gather their remaining forces. "Leave the wounded assets. They're a liability now," he declared coldly, waving dismissively toward Nyx and her cubs. The Vranax, a ruthless species known for their logical detachment, treated their wolves as tools, disposable when broken. The order was met with silent compliance from their ranks, no one sparing a glance back at the wolves who had fought so fiercely for their masters. Ethan stood among the human soldiers assigned to the Empire's forces, his pulse hammering in his ears. He had seen brutality before, but something about this moment froze him in place. Nyx had been more than a weapon in the chaos of battle. He'd seen her fight with strategy, shielding her cubs with her massive body while taking down foes with precision. Now she lay dying, discarded as if she were nothing. Her cubs whimpered softly, their tiny forms huddled against her, helpless and uncomprehending. "Ethan, move it!" barked one of his squad mates. The humans in the Empire were considered versatile and resourceful, but they were expected to follow orders without question. Ethan knew that staying behind could jeopardize his standing, even his life. Yet, as he looked back at the wolves, he couldn't shake the knot tightening in his chest. That evening, the military camp buzzed with the after-effects of victory. Soldiers laughed and recounted their close calls, their camaraderie masking the grim reality of what they'd left behind. Ethan, however, couldn't eat, couldn't laugh. The image of Nyx's bloody form haunted him, and the sound of her cubs' cries seemed to echo in his mind. He knew the planet's cold nights would finish what the battle had started. He paced outside his tent, the distant hills where they'd fought silhouetted against the fading light. "What are you doing?" one of his comrades asked, noticing Ethan's restlessness. "Thinking about those wolves again? Forget it, man. They're not worth it." Ethan nodded absently, but his decision had already been made. Late into the night, under the cover of darkness, he gathered what supplies he could: medical kits, rations, water. His heart pounded as he slipped past the perimeter, avoiding patrols and risking everything for a cause he couldn't fully explain, even to himself. When he reached the battlefield, the sight nearly broke him. Nyx was still alive, though barely. Her sides rose and fell weakly, and her cubs had nestled into the curve of her body for warmth. They looked up as Ethan approached, their glowing eyes full of caution and curiosity. Nyx lifted her head with immense effort, a low growl rumbling from her throat. Even now, she was ready to protect her cubs. Ethan crouched slowly, setting down the supplies. "Easy, girl," he murmured, his voice soft and steady. He didn't move closer, allowing her to assess him from a distance. He opened a canteen, pouring water into a shallow dish, and pushed it toward her with deliberate slowness. Nyx hesitated, her growl fading as exhaustion overtook her. Finally, she nudged the dish with her nose and drank, her body trembling with effort. The cubs, emboldened by their mother's acceptance, ventured closer. They sniffed at Ethan, their tiny tails flicking nervously. He didn't reach out, letting them come to him on their own terms. One of them, the smallest, gave a tentative lick to his outstretched hand, and Ethan felt a pang in his chest. These weren't weapons. They were lives, innocent and fragile, undeserving of the fate the Vranax had decreed. Over the next few hours, Ethan worked silently, his movements efficient and purposeful. He cleaned Nyx's wounds as best he could, applying antiseptics and bandages from the stolen medical kit. The alpha wolf flinched at first, but as the pain subsided, her growls ceased. She watched him intently, her golden eyes sharp despite her weakened state. Ethan could feel her intelligence, her awareness. She wasn't just an animal, she understood that he was helping her. The cubs stayed close, their trust growing with each passing minute. Ethan shared his rations, breaking the food into small pieces for them. They ate eagerly, their tails wagging now, the first signs of hope returning to their tiny bodies. As dawn began to creep over the horizon, Ethan sat back, exhaustion washing over him. Nyx's breathing was steadier now, her body less tense. She didn't take her eyes off him, but there was no hostility in her gaze, only cautious acceptance. As he prepared to leave, Ethan knew he was crossing a line he couldn't uncross. Helping them once wouldn't be enough. If he walked away now, they wouldn't survive. Yet if he stayed, he'd be risking more than his career. He'd be risking his life. The Empire didn't tolerate disobedience, especially not for something as insignificant as an abandoned wolf and her cubs. But as he looked at Nyx, at the cubs who now followed him with tiny, uncertain steps, Ethan knew there was no other choice. For the first time in his military career, he was prepared to defy everything he'd been taught. Because no matter what the Empire said, this wasn't just about survival. It was about doing what was right. Ethan returned the next night, careful to avoid the watchful eyes of patrols. This time, he carried more supplies, antiseptics, energy bars, and a tattered blanket he'd found in the storage room. He moved quickly and silently, his training serving him well in avoiding detection. As he approached the spot where he'd left Nyx and her cubs, he felt a surge of relief to see the faint glint of her golden eyes reflecting in the dim moonlight. She was alive, and she was waiting. Nyx's growl was softer this time, less of a threat and more a warning. Ethan paused, setting the supplies down a few feet away. He crouched low, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said softly. She didn't lunge or snarl, but her gaze remained fixed on him, unwavering. One of the cubs ventured forward, sniffing at the pile of supplies before retreating to its mother's side. Slowly, Ethan began unpacking, showing her what he'd brought. He laid out food and water first, then unfolded the blanket and spread it over the cold ground nearby. Nyx seemed to recognize his intentions. Though still wary, she allowed him to approach closer than the night before. Her wounds, hastily treated, needed more care. Ethan knelt beside her, moving cautiously, and began the delicate task of cleaning and reapplying bandages. Her growl rumbled low in her chest, but she didn't snap or pull away. She was still watching him closely, but there was no mistaking the flicker of understanding in her eyes. The cubs were growing bolder with every visit. As Ethan worked, they darted around him, sniffing his boots and tugging at the edges of the blanket with their tiny teeth. One climbed onto his leg, its small claws scraping against his fatigues. He smiled despite himself. "You're not as scary as your mom," he murmured, scratching behind the cub's ear. It yipped softly in response, a sound more playful than fearful. The other cubs soon followed, their initial shyness giving way to curiosity. Nyx watched it all, her sharp gaze darting between Ethan and her cubs. Though her body remained tense, she didn't stop them. It was as if she were testing him, allowing him to prove himself to her through their acceptance. Ethan felt the weight of her scrutiny but didn't waver. He was here for her and her cubs, no matter how long it took to earn their trust. By the third night, the change in their dynamic was undeniable. Nyx no longer growled at his approach. Instead, she raised her head, her ears twitching at the sound of his footsteps. The cubs ran to greet him, their tiny tails wagging furiously. Ethan knelt to greet them, letting them climb onto his lap as he unpacked his supplies. Nyx's wounds were healing, though slowly, and her energy was returning. She was still thin, her ribs visible beneath her dark fur, but her breathing was steady, and her eyes no longer held the dull haze of exhaustion. Ethan began introducing simple commands to the cubs, testing their intelligence. "Come here," he said, patting his knee. One cub tilted its head, then took a hesitant step forward. "Good," Ethan encouraged, offering a small piece of dried meat as a reward. Within minutes, all three cubs were responding to his voice, their eagerness to please evident in their wagging tails and bright eyes. Nyx observed in silence, her gaze calculating but calm. What surprised Ethan most was how quickly they learned. These weren't ordinary animals. The cubs seemed to understand not just his words but his intentions, reacting to his tone and body language with startling precision. Even Nyx, though she didn't participate, appeared to comprehend his actions. It was as if she were evaluating him, deciding whether he was worthy of their trust. Ethan couldn't help but marvel at the Vranax wolves' intelligence. He'd read about them in the Empire's military briefings, how they were bred for loyalty and ferocity, how their natural instincts made them perfect weapons. But those reports had failed to capture their depth, their individuality. Nyx wasn't just a tool, and her cubs weren't mindless assets. They were a family, fiercely protective of each other and capable of emotions the Vranax refused to acknowledge. As the days turned into weeks, the bond between Ethan and the wolves grew stronger. Nyx no longer flinched when he touched her, and her cubs followed him with unshakable trust. He began to see glimpses of her personality, a quiet strength, a fierce determination to protect her young. She wasn't just surviving, she was adapting, learning to work with him instead of against him. Ethan started teaching them more complex commands, pushing their limits to see what they could do. He set up small obstacles, using the surrounding terrain to create challenges. The cubs tackled each task with enthusiasm, their intelligence shining through in the way they approached each problem. Nyx watched from the sidelines, her gaze never leaving her cubs. It wasn't long before she began participating, her natural leadership asserting itself as she guided her cubs through the exercises. For Ethan, these moments were a revelation. He'd always been taught to follow orders, to see the galaxy in black and white, friend or foe, asset or liability. But Nyx and her cubs defied those labels. They were more than he'd ever expected, more than the Vranax could ever understand. They weren't tools. They were beings, capable of loyalty and trust, of learning and adapting. One night, as the cubs curled up around him, their soft fur warming his legs, Ethan looked at Nyx. She lay a few feet away, her golden eyes reflecting the faint starlight. For the first time, he felt a sense of mutual understanding pass between them. She had accepted him, not just as a caretaker but as part of her pack. It was a bond that transcended species, built on trust and respect. Ethan knew the risks he was taking. If his commanding officer discovered what he'd been doing, the consequences would be severe. But as he sat there, surrounded by Nyx and her cubs, he couldn't bring himself to care. For the first time in years he felt like he was doing something that mattered. And he wasn't going to stop, no matter what the Empire thought. Ethan's secret couldn't stay hidden forever. His nightly trips to the abandoned battlefield had become too frequent to ignore, and the questioning looks from his squadmates had turned into whispers. One evening, just as he was preparing to slip out again, his commanding officer caught him. The sharp tone of authority cut through the air like a blade. "Reynolds, where do you think you're going?" Ethan froze, his heart pounding. He'd rehearsed excuses in his mind, but standing under the officer's piercing gaze, they all sounded hollow. "Just taking a walk, sir," he said, his voice steady but his body tense. "A walk?" The officer's eyes narrowed. "Strange how your walks seem to coincide with stolen supplies. Medical kits, rations, blankets, ring a bell? Care to explain why half your gear is unaccounted for?" Ethan swallowed hard, knowing denial would only make things worse. Still, he couldn't admit the truth outright. "I've been helping survivors," he said finally. "It felt wrong to leave them to die." The officer's expression hardened, his voice dropping to a dangerous level. "Survivors? You mean the animals the Vranax abandoned? You're risking court-martial for wolves?" He stepped closer, his tone sharp with disbelief. "Do you have any idea what kind of trouble you're inviting? Those creatures are nothing but tools, Reynolds. They were left for a reason." Ethan's fists clenched, but he kept his voice calm. "They're more than tools. They're intelligent, loyal, and they don't deserve to die like that." The officer shook his head, his voice filled with scorn. "This isn't about what they deserve. It's about following orders. This is your last warning. Drop this foolishness, or you'll be facing the consequences." Ethan nodded, feigning compliance, but his resolve only hardened. He couldn't abandon Nyx and her cubs, not after everything they'd been through together. That night, he visited them again, his determination stronger than ever. Nyx greeted him with a low, rumbling growl that had transformed into something almost welcoming over the weeks. The cubs bounded toward him, tails wagging furiously, their excitement infectious. But the sense of peace was short-lived. The next day, a new threat emerged, one far more dangerous than his commanding officer's disapproval. A rival faction, the Quarterans, had arrived on the planet, their scouts combing the area for valuable resources. The Vranax wolves, with their unparalleled intelligence and combat prowess, were high on their list. Rumors of Ethan's nightly trips had reached the wrong ears, and now the Quarterans were hunting. Ethan discovered the threat by accident. While scouting for a safer location for Nyx and her cubs, he stumbled upon a Quarteran patrol. Their alien voices were sharp and guttural, but the intent was clear: capture the wolves at all costs. His mind raced as he slipped away, unseen. If the Quarterans found Nyx, they wouldn't hesitate to take her and the cubs. Worse, they'd likely weaponize them, turning them into tools of destruction. He couldn't let that happen. That night, as he sat with Nyx, he made his decision. "We can't stay here," he said softly, his voice carrying a mix of urgency and reassurance. Nyx tilted her head, her sharp eyes locking onto his as if she understood. The cubs, sensing his tension, huddled closer. The next few days were a blur of preparation. Ethan mapped out an escape route, identifying a distant canyon that could provide temporary shelter. It was risky, Quarteran patrols were everywhere, and the terrain was harsh, but it was their best chance. Nyx seemed to sense the gravity of the situation. She stayed close to him, her movements purposeful and protective, while the cubs followed his commands with unwavering trust. The first leg of their journey was uneventful, but the quiet didn't last. On the second night, the Quarterans caught up to them. Ethan heard the telltale hum of their hovercrafts moments before the ambush. The wolves reacted instantly, Nyx placing herself between her cubs and the approaching threat. Ethan drew his weapon, his pulse racing as the Quarterans emerged from the shadows, their eyes gleaming with predatory intent. "Hand over the wolves," one of them snarled, their translator crackling with malice. "Or die." Ethan didn't hesitate. "You'll have to go through me," he said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. He knew he was outnumbered and outgunned, but he wasn't about to back down. The fight was chaotic and brutal. Ethan's training kicked in, his shots precise as he took down the first wave of attackers. Nyx and her cubs fought beside him, their coordination astonishing. Nyx moved like a shadow, her powerful jaws clamping down on the nearest Quarteran while her cubs darted in and out, their small size making them difficult targets. Together, they were a force to be reckoned with. But the Quarterans were relentless. For every enemy they took down, another seemed to appear. Ethan's heart sank as he realized they were being cornered. He called out to Nyx, signaling her to retreat, but she didn't budge. Instead, she charged forward, her growl a deafening roar as she tore into the next wave of attackers. Her cubs followed, their bravery unmatched despite their youth. It was Nyx's intelligence that turned the tide. As the Quarterans advanced, she led her cubs into a narrow ravine, forcing their enemies to funnel through a single choke point. Ethan took up position above the ravine, using the high ground to pick off the attackers one by one. The wolves' ferocity combined with Ethan's strategic advantage finally broke the Quarterans' assault. When the dust settled, Ethan and the wolves were battered but alive. Nyx's fur was streaked with blood, but her eyes were bright, her stance unyielding. The cubs, though visibly shaken, stood tall beside her. Ethan felt a surge of pride as he looked at them. They weren't just surviving, they were fighting for their place in a galaxy that had deemed them expendable. As they regrouped, Ethan realized the gravity of what they'd just accomplished. They had faced overwhelming odds and won, not because of brute strength alone, but because of their bond, their trust in each other. It was a victory that went beyond survival. It was a testament to what they could achieve together. But Ethan knew this was only the beginning. The Quarterans wouldn't give up so easily, and the Empire wouldn't tolerate his defiance for long. Their fight wasn't over, but for the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope. Together, they were stronger than anyone had anticipated. And as long as they stood together, they would find a way to survive. Ethan guided Nyx and her cubs toward the distant canyon he'd scouted earlier. The harsh terrain made every step a challenge, but the wolves moved with instinctive grace, their sharp senses catching potential threats before Ethan could spot them. Despite the weight of exhaustion and the lingering fear of pursuit, they pressed on, driven by a shared determination to reach safety. Ethan carried one of the smaller cubs when it lagged behind, the tiny creature nuzzling into his chest as if it trusted him completely. When they finally reached the canyon, Ethan took a moment to catch his breath. The towering rock walls provided a natural barrier, and the sparse vegetation offered enough cover to obscure them from passing patrols. It wasn't perfect, but it would do for now. He set up a temporary camp, using what little equipment he had left. Nyx watched him closely, her golden eyes scanning their surroundings even as her cubs collapsed in a pile of fur, too tired to do more than yawn and stretch. Over the next few days, Ethan focused on fortifying their position and ensuring the wolves had enough to eat. He scavenged for supplies in the surrounding area, careful to avoid detection. The cubs, now more energetic, began exploring the canyon, their playful antics a brief reminder of innocence in an otherwise dire situation. Nyx, ever the watchful guardian, allowed them their freedom but remained vigilant, her ears constantly twitching at the faintest sound. Ethan used the time to deepen his bond with the wolves. He expanded their training, teaching them more complex commands that could help in case of another attack. Nyx took to the training with remarkable efficiency, often leading her cubs through exercises without needing Ethan's guidance. It was clear she understood not only the commands but the purpose behind them. She wasn't just following orders, she was strategizing, adapting to their new reality with an intelligence that astounded Ethan. One evening, as the cubs played nearby, Ethan sat beside Nyx, the firelight casting flickering shadows on her sleek fur. She seemed more relaxed now, her wounds healing and her strength returning. Ethan looked at her, his voice soft. "I don't know how we're going to keep this up, Nyx. But I promise I won't let them take you. Not you, not the cubs." Nyx turned her head to meet his gaze, her eyes reflecting the firelight. There was something in her expression that went beyond animal instinct, a sense of understanding, almost as if she recognized the weight of his words. For the first time, Ethan felt like he wasn't just protecting them. They were protecting him, too. But their fragile peace couldn't last forever. One night, while Ethan was on watch, a faint hum reached his ears. He froze, his hand tightening around his weapon. It was a sound he'd come to dread, the unmistakable drone of an approaching scout ship. The Quarterans were still searching for them, and they were getting closer. Ethan quickly woke Nyx, who roused her cubs with a low, urgent growl. They moved as one, slipping into the shadows of the canyon to avoid detection. The ship passed overhead, its searchlights cutting through the darkness. Ethan held his breath as the light swept dangerously close, illuminating the jagged rocks around them. Nyx stood perfectly still, her body tense and ready to spring into action if needed. The cubs huddled against her, their tiny bodies trembling but silent. When the ship finally moved on, Ethan exhaled, his heart pounding in his chest. They couldn't stay here any longer. The Quarterans were relentless, and it was only a matter of time before they found this place. Ethan made the decision to leave the planet entirely. It was a desperate plan, but their only chance for survival lay in finding a place where the Quarterans and the Empire couldn't reach them. He began preparing for their escape, using his knowledge of the area to locate an old, abandoned transport ship hidden in the wreckage of a nearby battlefield. It was a long shot, but if he could get it operational, they might just have a chance. The journey to the ship was grueling. The wolves moved with quiet precision, their senses alert for any sign of danger. Ethan led the way, his weapon ready, every shadow and sound putting him on edge. When they finally reached the wreckage, he was relieved to find the ship mostly intact. It was old and battered, but with some work, it could still fly. While Ethan worked to repair the ship, Nyx and her cubs stood guard. It was as if they understood the importance of what he was doing, their vigilance unbroken even as hours turned into days. Ethan marveled at their resilience, their ability to adapt to every challenge they faced. They weren't just surviving, they were thriving, and it gave him the strength to keep going. When the ship was finally ready, Ethan loaded the wolves aboard, his heart racing with a mix of fear and hope. As the engines roared to life, the sound echoed through the canyon, sending a shiver down his spine. It was only a matter of time before someone noticed. He pushed the ship to its limits, the ground shaking as they lifted off. The Corderans would surely detect them now, but Ethan didn't care. They had a chance, and he wasn't going to waste it. The pursuit was swift and unforgiving. Corderan ships appeared on their radar within minutes, their weapons locking on to Ethan's stolen transport. He maneuvered with everything he had, dodging blasts and weaving through the planet's atmosphere in a desperate attempt to escape. Nyx and her cubs huddled in the cargo hold, their trust in him unwavering despite the chaos around them. It was Nyx who saved them in the end. As the Corderans closed in, she seemed to sense the danger, her instincts sharper than any technology. She nudged one of the cubs toward a hidden compartment in the ship, signaling for Ethan to follow. He hesitated for only a moment before realizing what she was showing him, a panel containing emergency countermeasures. With Nyx's guidance, he activated the systems, releasing a cloud of electromagnetic interference that temporarily disabled the pursuing ships. The maneuver gave them just enough time to escape. As they broke through the planet's atmosphere and into the vast expanse of space, Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. They were free, for now. In the days that followed, Ethan navigated the ship toward an uncharted region of the galaxy. He'd heard rumors of habitable planets far from the Empire's reach, places where they could start anew. Nyx and her cubs seemed to sense the change in their circumstances, their tension easing as the stars stretched out before them. When they finally landed on a small, lush planet, Ethan knew they'd found their sanctuary. The air was fresh, the land untouched by war or exploitation. As he stepped onto the soft grass, Nyx and her cubs followed, their movements light and unburdened. It was the first time Ethan had seen them truly at peace. Ethan began building a new life for them, one free from the shadows of the Empire and the Corderans. Nyx and her cubs thrived in their new home, their bond with Ethan unbreakable. They weren't just a pack, they were a family, forged in the fires of survival and strengthened by trust. Years later, explorers would stumble upon this hidden sanctuary, their stories spreading through the galaxy. They spoke of a human who had defied the odds, of a wolf pack that had become more than anyone thought possible. Together, they became a symbol of resilience, of what could be achieved when compassion and courage triumphed over fear.